Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Stecker Show. I was looking at some pictures on the internet a couple days ago and I ran into some stuff that caught my attention, and I decided to take a risk and show it to my wife, and turns out she's into that kind of thing as well. So with her birthday coming up, she gave me an order to make her, much to my surprise, a whole bunch of cheese and cracker serving boards. You know, everybody's got their thing, I'm not going to judge. She asked for 3 of them, but I think I'm going to try to be an overachiever and make 10 or more. Actually, I have 15 blanks glued up right now. So to have this done in the required time frame, I'm going to need to have an effective process. I can't just start each one of these as its own individual project, set it aside, and then move on to the next one. I had to go a little bit more production style method. So I'm going to have to come up with a process of how I'm going to do it, and some jigs and templates to get me through pretty quickly, and then set up my machine so that I can move from one to the other in a pretty efficient manner. Well, let's take a look at how this is going to work out. Well, this is the template that makes the whole thing work, and I have a bunch of steps in the process laid out here. As you can see, I have, I think, 14 blanks all together glued up. I have a variety of plain wood, some wood with a little bit more variety in it, a little figure. I have some horizontally laminated pieces, and I have some vertically laminated pieces. Just a whole bunch of whatever scrap I had sitting around is getting turned into this. And then I have a bunch of leftovers here that I can use for another scrap wood project later on. So all scrap wood projects turn into more scrap wood projects. That's the way it goes. The way this thing works is that I have a couple guide blocks on the bottom that are the width of my blank, and some screws on the top so that I can adjust it, get it centered, and if I make something that's a little bit different size, I can adjust this guide to match. And this also helps me lay everything out. So this is step 1 right here. It's just a plain board that is cut to approximately the right width. I think this is around 2 5/8, but you make it whatever works for you. And then I start by sliding this inside the template, and I start making some marks. Mark for the end, mark for the, slide it up here, and mark for the handle, slide it again, and then I do the marks for the inside. And what I end up with is this second step right there. And this allows me to go over to the bandsaw, or the jigsaw, or scroll saw, or whatever, and do a rough cut around here. And you can see that I left the line, because I'm going to go to the router table next and use a flush trim bit after I mount the template back in here to follow along the outside of the template and cut these profiles real nice and smooth. Once that's done, I'm going to go to my plunge router, pop the template back on there, and I'll use this as a guide right here to use a bowl cutting bit to cut out the inside of this. And then after that, I'll move on to a smaller router, or the router table, we'll see. But I have a little handheld router I was using to cut an 1/8 of an inch round over on the outside. And then, just because it's a little bit more comfortable it feels a little blocky like that, I switch over to a 1/4 of an inch round over for the final step, the final cutting step, to get this edge rounded over a little bit more. I think 3/8 would have been better, but then the bearing actually moves up and starts running on the rounded over part, so it doesn't always work out quite as you want it to. I'm going to go with a 1/4 inch round over. It's good enough. I've seen some pictures of these online that are nice and carved out, so it's everything's perfectly rounded. But just because of time, I'm not going to do it that way. I'm shooting for an efficient process that gets me to a very good and usable end product. So let's take a quick look and go through the steps. I don't think I'm that different from a lot of woodworkers in that I would rather eat a frozen pine cone than change my bandsaw blade. So even though I have a 1/4 inch blade, I'm just going to use the nibble until complete method to get all of these cuts done here using my 3/4 inch blade. Now that I have all of these cut to the approximate size, I can put them back into the template and run them through the router table to do the final trimming. Now, of course, you can just do this with a jigsaw or bandsaw, scroll saw, or whatever, and then sand this to whatever your finished dimensions are. I just happen to have this good flush trim bit from Whiteside. It's the ultimate flush trim bit, and it's got two opposing shear angles on it, so it does a really smooth cut even when it's going through end grain. If you have a straight flush trimming bit, you want to be careful when you're rounding these corners, especially when you get up on the handle side, because here you're going downhill into the grain and it's going to be likely to chip if you go too fast. So all I got to do is line this up. Come back here. All I got to do is line this up on my my line from before, and I'll throw on a clamp just to make sure that it doesn't slide around inside the template, and then I'm ready to go. Now that I have all of the outside perimeter stuff cleaned up on the router, move to the inside. I just slide it back into the same jig and line it up with my marks. Then it goes into the vise, and I'm ready to start working my way down little by little. That's a nice one. Since my router doesn't have dust collection built in, I had to spend a couple hours cleaning the dust out of the shop. And now I'm ready to move on to the next step, which I hadn't mentioned in the beginning, but I am going to round over the corners on all of these just a little bit using the oscillating spindle sander. You could also do that at the routing step, or the template routing step, by making your template as wide as the board that you're going to use for the tray. But I wanted to have a wider one that was adjustable for different sizes, so that's how I did it. One quick note on that template, a safety note, kind of important. If I were to do this over again, I would probably use heavier screws and make these, I have a 3/8 of an inch recess cut in there so the screw is countersunk a little bit, and there's a washer on there. I would probably make these things wider, maybe 5/8 or at least 1/2 inch, put on a bigger washer, because this MDF that I use for the template it's pretty strong, but when you tighten that screw down, it starts to compress a little bit. So that caused a little bit of shifting, and when I was cutting this ash one, this is probably one of the hardest ones out of the whole batch. As I turn the corner here on the router, keep in mind if the router bit is spinning this way, right? When you go this way, it's going uphill, and then as soon as you turn the corner, now the router is cutting downhill into that grain, and it wants to catch. And that's exactly what it did. It caught and it jerked the board and did a little damage to the end there, and it messed with my screws a little bit here too and shifted everything inside the jig. So I had to stop and take it all apart, put it back together to get everything realigned. So that's especially if you're not using one of those cool up shear, down shear white side bits, and it's just a straight template bit. Be very careful when you're going into the different direction on the grain, and make sure that you have a very firm grip on the template and the wood, and that your fingers are nowhere near the blade when it happens. I was lucky. I didn't have any kind of injuries from this one, but it could have been worse. Now it's back to the router table to put a 1/8 of an inch round over on all of the outside edges. I'm not going to do anything with the inside. It's not quite deep enough for this round over to work. If I had maybe made these a little bit thicker and made that probably just another 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch deeper, that would be okay, but I just went a 1/2 inch deep on these. So I'll just do some hand sanding to smooth that out, and I'll use the 1/8 inch here, and then I'll switch out the bit and I'll do a 1/4 of an inch round over on the handle. And now for the final cutting step, I set up a stop that I'll slide up to this mark that I made earlier. And this is going to allow me to route out a 1/4 of an inch round over on the handle, using this to control my depth so that it doesn't cut into the sides, and I can have a handle that's just a little bit more round. I just thought that felt a little bit nicer. If I have the time later, maybe I'll take some of these and carve it out a little bit, but probably not. I think I'm just going to stick with the router bit because time is a factor. I have 1 day left to have these things finished, and I better get moving. I have 15 of these ready to go. I'd love to put the first coat of oil on, but first I have to go through the ordeal of sanding, which is the absolute worst part of every woodworking project. And I'm going to have to spend forever sanding these things because there are a lot of inside edges and details that I got to work on. However, I think I can work with a process and good materials that'll speed things up a little bit. I did one of these by hand first, and it took about 20 minutes times 15. That's not going to happen. And Christmas is only in a couple days, so I don't have a lot of time to get these done. One thing that's going to help me out is this flexible foam pad. It's not as flexible in the freezing cold garage right now, but this thing's great for like inside of bowls and stuff in the lathe. And it works well for these too because it's the 2-inch pad fits right inside here, and I can even out some of the grooves on the bottom of the serving trays, which is already pretty smooth because I use white side router bits for everything, and the white side bits don't generally leave a lot of splintering or burning, but there is going to be some, especially when cutting against the grain. So I had to work off some burn marks, and I got to clean up a few ridges on the bottom. For the most part, everything's pretty smooth. So this is going to help me out a little bit with time. Another thing is instead of using the regular paper-backed sandpaper, which tends to tear and fall apart pretty easily, I had a box of just random cutoffs. When they make sanding belts, there's always some, they cut these things off this way, and then there's always some leftover at the end that doesn't quite make up to enough for a full belt. So they'll sell these things in rolls as like a woodworker sanding pack, and you get a whole bunch of different grits and stuff, but it's great for turning stuff on the lathe or for small sanding projects. These are paper backed, which means they're going to be more durable, more flexible. They're intended to be flexible, like for a sanding belt, whereas this stuff is normally intended to be kept pretty flat. So I have some paper-backed paper on a block that I'm going to use for cleaning up the faces and the back. Then I have the sanding cup, or the sanding pad that I will use for cleaning up the inside. I have some paper, cloth-backed rather, I think it's 100 grit that I can use for cleaning up any burn marks on the inside edges. And then I can move down to the 180 grit cloth back paper for cleaning stuff up and just doing all the curves. And one other thing that's going to speed things up is using the vise. So instead of sanding with one hand, which will take a very long time, I can lock this guy into my vise, and then I can sand with two hands and move a lot faster and work on a lot of these details and using twice the ability. So I guess it's time to get started. I'm going to take these down to probably 240 grit, I think is what this is. I'll do the final with some of this paper back because this green stuff is, I think, 220 grit, but it's really not that good. So I'm going to go down to the 240 grit on the paper back paper and see if I can get all of these done in hopefully an hour and a half or less. I'm finally finished with the sanding. It took about 2.5, maybe 3 hours in the end, partially because the Velcro on one of my little sanding discs stopped working, and also because I stopped to fix a couple defects in some of the boards. But the important thing is that I'm finished and ready to put on the oil. For this, I'm using water locks. It's going to stink for a while, but once the solvent evaporates, it's completely food safe, and it'll give a good layer of protection. I'm just going to put on one coat because the wood on these is thin enough in most places that I think it's going to soak into the center pretty well and offer an adequate degree of protection. Underneath everything, I have just whatever I could find sitting around. I have some aluminum drip edge from a roof and some angle iron, not angle iron, corner bead for drywall. I'm just going to use that to keep these off of the plastic so there's a little air circulation and they dry faster. And I think with that, I'm ready to go. Man, that is a thing of beauty. I am really happy with how these turned out. This was a lot of fun. There we have 15 completely unique scrap wood cheese and cracker serving trays. Now, if you happen to build something like this, or if you have an idea of how I can improve the jig or the template, please feel free to post it in the comments section, and don't worry about self-promotion. I kind of like that kind of stuff. I would like to see what you make. Thanks for watching, and have fun.